Hello, my name is Manny Jules. I'm the Chief Commissioner of the First Nations Tax Commission here in Canada. And I'm going to give you a brief history of Indigenous economics and the role of pandemics and colonization and the loss of tax jurisdiction and First Nations title to our lands. And I also want to talk about some of the impacts of COVID-19 and the three systemic gaps First Nations are working to close. And I also want to explore some opportunities to work together to support a stronger Indigenous economic recovery strategy. In 1997, I went to visit Chichen Itza on the Yucatan Peninsula. And it was at that moment on September the 21st, I got an epiphany. Realizing that we were able to have complex societies, scientists, engineers, artists, spiritual leaders, chefs, geneticists, all of those things went into making El Castillo in Chichen Itza. And it was at that time that I realized that we have to be able to build our own infrastructure, that we have to be able to restore our jurisdictions that allowed us to flourish some 1,500 years ago, and having the scientific ability and engineering ability to build these types of marvels in Mesoamerica. This is Kodak Verga. Goes back to the Aztecs around Mexico City, present-day Mexico City. This shows that we had property rights and tax jurisdiction prior to colonization. These are little surveyed plots for individuals' property rights and the state or the government's ability to be able to tax those properties to put in infrastructure and to build their economies. The power of pandemics is incredible. If it wasn't for pandemics, we probably would have still had jurisdiction over the Americas. But because of, in the words of one famous author, because of guns, germs, and steel, we lost our traditional territories and were subsequently colonized. And so the impact of pandemics on our cultures has been horrific. But what we've been able to do, because we're a resilient people, is come back and we've survived. This is the story of our loss of tax jurisdiction and title. For us here in Canada, it goes back to 1927. For Shuswap, which I'm a Shuswap. We weren't subject to a treaty, nor were we subject to losing our lands through battles. We lost our lands and jurisdiction as a direct result of the smallpox epidemics here in British Columbia in 1862 and 1863. And then, because of our ability to be able to raise our own revenues, we were able to fight the land question here in British Columbia. And that was thwarted ultimately by the federal and provincial governments working in collusion to amend the Indian Act in 1927 that forbid us from raising our own revenues to fight the land question, what we call the land question here in British Columbia. And that was a direct result of a Nigerian tribe in Africa asking the British Privy Council to deal with the question of their land rights Of course, this sent fears to the colonial governments here. And ultimately, that's why the Indian Act was amended and why we are so dependent on federal and provincial transfers for our governments today. The story of this past year has been one that's affected all of us globally. And one of the things that I really was inspiring to me was this lady nurse in Manaus in Brazil. You can see in the photograph that she's wearing her macaw headdress. And what was happening is she was trying to get the attention of the Brazilian government to help Indigenous people. Upwards of 35 tribes live in Manaus. To no avail. Until she started wearing her macaw headdress, people weren't paying attention to her. So a whole generation of people have died as a result of COVID-19. All of our encyclopedic knowledge of our lands, our birds, our medicines have gone to rest with those individuals. And this has been repeated many, many times throughout the centuries now. And so what I want to acknowledge is all of those individuals in Indigenous communities that were on the front lines of fighting this invisible disease that we're having to deal with, COVID-19. COVID-19 had a bigger impact on us than other governments. Our businesses were more vulnerable because we were involved in casinos, resource industry, tourism. All of those were affected by social distancing. A lot of our businesses had to close, casinos as an example. And this had a huge impact. Our households, because we live in overcrowded situations and our people have lower incomes and less ability to borrow, huge impact. And you could see it in the Navajo reservation, in a lot of our communities now, and even ourselves here in Kamloops. During the first phase of COVID, we had very few, as a matter of fact, no infections here in my own reserve until just recently. And, we had 1, 2 just before Christmas, and now it's in excess of 20 members of our community. And so it's an incredible situation that all of us find ourselves in. Financial institutions, less access to borrow dollars. Governments, lower tax revenues, less access to public borrowing. And that is because of the fragility of our economies. We have to change this. And that's one of the things that really was our people have been exposed to the bare facts of COVID-19, that risk management does matter, that we have to be ready in the future for another pandemic, because one inevitably will happen. And it's going to be not once in a century, but I predict it'll be more times that our people will have to be facing this situation, and we can't find ourselves in a situation where we are so completely dependent on other governments that we can't look after ourselves. So public health matters. We have to be able to have our own institutions to be able to deal with this. In the future, because of here in Canada, it's going to be $1 trillion deficit. In the United States, it's going to be substantially more. But the competition for future transfers is going to be really intense, because you're going to have a generation that are going to have to pay down massive debts because of COVID-19. And we're going to be at the short end of the stick. And so that's why fiscal issues matter to us. That's why fiscal powers matter, because without true governmental powers, the ability to be able to tax, the ability to be able to have our own title to our lands matters. But this also is an opportunity to close the systemic gaps. Here in this country, in Canada, our infrastructure deficit is $25 to $30 billion. And that's because of the liability of the federal government. And to manage liability, you're not going to be spending the amount of resources that are going to be made available in other circumstances. And so we lack legislation, we lack standards, and institutions like our own Infrastructure Institute, and the lack of fiscal options, meaning that the ability to have a wide range of tax jurisdiction, and capacity, meaning we haven't got the people who've got to be able, who could be in a position to look after all of our needs. The fiscal gap is 31 billion. And this is, again, the potential that we've got to be able to contribute to the overall marketplace. The credit gap, which is incredible in this country, it's $175 billion. And that's because of colonial pieces of legislation like the Indian Act, the lack of jurisdiction over our own lands, and we're missing important pieces of the puzzle, most notably the ownership of our own lands. And that would be recognized by having our own land title system. We have the lack of legislative options because of legislative time, both provincially, territorially, as well as at the federal government level, just finding the amount of parliamentary time. And the same is true with the United States. You know, the United States right now seems more interested in, fighting the politics as opposed to the real issues, which are, in my view, economic. We lack economic opportunities. There's a financial bias against us because of the lack of infrastructure, because of the lack of legislation. Our strategy for closing these gaps is to lobby the federal government, and the federal government will be introducing federal legislation to recognize UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous People. The provincial government here in British Columbia has passed legislation. But we still need federal legislation to clarify the jurisdiction, so there can be an orderly vacating and occupying of jurisdictions. We need First Nation legislation to fill the jurisdictional space so that we can eventually legislate our way back into the economy. First Nation institutions need to maximize benefits from the jurisdiction. This is really about that guy looking at you right now. That's my dad, Clarence Jules Sr. He always talked to me after a meeting. He was the chief of my community for 10 years and on council for another 15. I myself was chief of my community for 16 years and on council for 10. So together, as father and son, we had over 50 years of experience in dealing with issues. And he was my mentor. But as I always say, my dad inspired me to do the work that I'm doing, but it was always my mother who made sure I was elected. But after I would go to a meeting and come back, he would always say, do they think like us? And for many years, I didn't understand what that simple sentence meant. And it's simply this, he talked about philosophy. And he wanted to know what an individual's philosophy was whom I met with. So when he asked, do they think like us? He simply meant, do they think like us to make the fundamental changes that are necessary for us to have economic freedoms? His view was always about economics, that if there's dollars to be raised on our reserve, it should stay here. We have to be able to look after ourselves. That's why we created Mount Paul Industrial Park, the most successful business that we've had for over 60 years now, that laid the foundation for our hope for an economic freedom. We want to be able to establish other opportunities for First Nations through institutions, through business opportunities, just like my dad did through the creation of Mount Paul Industrial Park, just like he did in trying to prevent the loss of our jurisdiction, whether it be dealing with riparian rights, water rights. All of those things are important. But on the top of it, he always told me that we can't make the changes that are necessary unless we got the dollars, unless we got the jurisdiction. And we have to be able to own our own land. So we want to assume more fiscal powers. We don't want more transfers from the federal and provincial governments. We want to be able to have taxes, jurisdiction. And the reason I say taxes is because here in the Pacific Northwest, we spell taxes this way, Taksis. That's the Chinook way of spelling this jurisdiction. So we understood the concept of taxation. We understood its implication. We understood its benefit. That's why we want to assume more fiscal powers. We want to lower the transactional costs through direct land management so that we would be able to own our own lands through our own land registry. My elder chiefs in 1910 sent a letter to the federal government. In that letter, they were asking for a definite understanding regarding lands, water, timber, game, fish, etc., to be settled. They also asked for schools, and at that time I was wondering why, because there were residential schools already in operation across the country, why they were still reiterating that we needed schools. It's like the adage, education is a tool or a weapon. And they recognized what was happening was education was being used as a weapon against us to take away who we were. What they were talking about was education in schools so that we would be able to educate ourselves so that, as they were saying, have our own doctor, because they lived through the smallpox epidemic. They knew that we needed our own doctors. They also said, we want to be self-sufficient in the amount of lands that should be given to us. And they also said, we want our own registry so that people will know who owns these lands forever. So lower transactional costs are all part of the strategy, because the lower the transactional costs, the greater the economic power that we'll have. But also, we have to be able to work together to do that. We have to implement more jurisdictions. So it isn't just about the fiscal, it's education, it's health, it's all of those aspects to support economic growth. We have to build sustainable economic infrastructure. with a new infrastructure institute. We have to create innovative and responsive administration and government systems like we're doing through Tulo. We have to share information, learn and innovate. That's the most important thing that we've got as human beings, is an ability to be able to use the gray matter between our ears to innovate, to make this world a better place for all of us. Some opportunities to work together. I was quite interested in the McGirt decision out of Oklahoma. These are some of the questions I wanted to raise with you. In Canada, we found this argument or this case very interesting. And it was also interesting that one of Trump's own appointees had the pen and wrote the majority of the decision on McGirt. So these are areas that I would definitely like to be able to work with you folks on, is how will this be impacting your communities, and how will we be able to work together to use this as an ability to be able to exert our jurisdiction within our treaty and traditional territories. I think that when we talk about opportunities to work together, to build a sustainable and resilient economy for tribal governments and First Nations here in Canada, I think that we have to, like other governments are going to be doing, thinking about the post-pandemic world and how they were impacted. I think we have to do the same thing. We have to go back, look at how this impacted us and how we can begin to devise a collective strategy so that we can begin to have a comparative study and a recovery strategy together. We've been working on developing a tribal economies game, and we'd like to work with you on that. We'd also like to work with you on developing more workshops and institutional developments. There's a lot of work that we can do together. These three individuals are my great ancestor leaders. Petit Louis was chief of my community from 1850 until he passed away in 1916. Johnny Chalhitsa, the other chief seated, was Okanagan. And we had our musket wars, the Shuswap and the Okanagan. We were killing one another at an incredible rate. And our community said this has to stop. We can't do this any longer. Our communities are hurting. And so we got together and had a Fish Lake Accord that stopped all of the killing. There was an exchange of children between Petit Louis's community, my community, and Johnny Chalhitsa. And this union between our tribes is still important to this day. The guy standing, Basil David, was the student to those two elder leaders. They were the ones I referred to from 1910. They lived through the smallpox epidemic. They saw their lands disappear, their jurisdictions disappear. But they gave us the resiliency and the philosophy that we're working on still to this day. So I suggest that we work together to help each other to be great and good. That our mission should be to restore and renew our jurisdictions and economies. That our strategy should be to creatively destroy the colonial jurisdictions with better Indigenous ones. Our philosophy, like my dad talked about, And these elder chiefs talked about, together we will help each other to be great and good. Thank you for this opportunity to address you. And I look forward to working with you over the many years ahead of us to create better Indigenous governments, better Indigenous economies, and a better way to be able to share our intellect, break down the border that prevents us from doing trade that we used to do in former days. Be safe.